1980, we was GDP number, I think, 12 globally, and then 2016.
In the high corridors where nations shape their destinies, agreements are never as simple as they appear in the headlines. What the public sees are documents signed, official handshakes, and promises of cooperation. But beneath those polished words lies something far more complex: hidden motives, ambitions cloaked in diplomacy, and strategies that reach far beyond the present moment. When Saudi Arabia's crown prince, Mohammed bin Salman, sat across from Ibrahim Traoré, the president of Burkina Faso, to negotiate a deal worth $2.5 billion, the world was quick to label it a pact of development and cooperation. Newspapers printed phrases like economic partnership and regional growth. Television screens showed rehearsed smiles and scripted speeches. Yet the real essence of their conversation, spoken in the absence of cameras and far from the noise of reporters, carried truths powerful enough to redefine not just their countries, but the way global politics itself is understood. Ibrahim Traoré, the soldier turned revolutionary who had risen to lead his nation, represented a new face of African leadership. He was young, defiant, and unwilling to bend to the weight of colonial influence. He was part of a generation that rejected the illusions of aid disguised as generosity and that placed national sovereignty above the desires of foreign powers. Mohammed bin Salman, on the other hand, embodied the transformation of Saudi Arabia. He was the ambitious visionary, determined to guide his kingdom away from oil dependency toward a future of mega projects, technological dominance, and a redefined role in the global order. On the surface, the two men could not have been more different. One commanded the wealth of oil and ruled from a monarchy that had stood for decades. The other fought for independence in a nation long scarred by external interference, coups, and exploitation. Yet in that meeting, what united them was an understanding of how the game of power was truly played. Global politics was no longer about generosity, nor about hollow speeches and temporary friendships. It was about leverage, endurance, and narrative control. Mohammed bin Salman leaned forward, lowering his tone to a near whisper. "Brother," he said, "this deal is not just about investment. It is about rewriting the rules of power for nations like ours." Those words cut deeper than any figure on the page. For generations, smaller nations had been told that alliances with powerful countries were always about support and aid. But here was a crown prince openly declaring the opposite: that politics is never driven by kindness, but by survival, positioning, and influence. He explained further. In global politics, money is not simply money. It is an instrument, a bargaining chip, a weapon in disguise. Saudi Arabia was not placing $2.5 billion on the table as a token of goodwill. No, the intention was clear: to secure a lasting foothold in Africa, a continent where Western powers, China, and others had long fought for dominance. Traoré understood this with clarity. His nation had endured the polished but poisonous promises of France, which spoke of partnership while exploiting Burkina Faso's resources. Every loan carried the kind of interest that bled the economy dry. Every program of aid came wrapped in conditions that stripped away sovereignty. And when leaders resisted, the punishment was swift: sanctions, coups, or orchestrated instability. So when Mohammed bin Salman revealed the true nature of the deal, Traoré did not flinch. He recognized it for what it was: not charity, but strategy. Politics, the Crown Prince continued, was never about the ink on a contract. It was about who held the influence, who told the story, and who determined the shape of tomorrow. The silence in the room carried more weight than any applause outside could have. Mohammed bin Salman's words unveiled the unwritten laws of power that few leaders admitted out loud. For him, every dollar spent abroad was designed not just to return profit, but also to return power. Funding infrastructure, building projects, creating partnerships. These were not random gestures of kindness. They were moves on a global chessboard, each designed to ensure that when decisions were made on the world stage, Saudi Arabia's voice could not be ignored. To Traoré, this was both a revelation and a reminder. For centuries, Africa had suffered because too many of its leaders misunderstood foreign investments. They saw money as help instead of recognizing it as control. Yet here was a man of immense influence, explaining the very lesson African revolutionaries had whispered for decades. Politics was a battlefield of power, not a moral game of good and evil. The $2.5 billion deal was, therefore, more than numbers. It was an invitation to enter a new political reality. If Burkina Faso blindly accepted the terms, It risked becoming another pawn in a much larger struggle. But if the deal was navigated wisely, it could become a tool for strengthening sovereignty, empowering the people, and building alliances outside the Western grip. Traoré's thoughts drifted back to Africa's bloody history. He remembered the fate of leaders like Thomas Sankara, who had been assassinated for refusing to bow to foreign exploitation. He recalled nations thrown into chaos when they challenged the monopoly of Western corporations. And now, across the table, sat a leader from outside that Western orbit, offering not resistance but strategy, a roadmap for survival through alignment. Then came a sharper revelation. The Crown Prince asked, "Do you know why the West fears Africa's deals with us, with Russia or with China?" Because it breaks their monopoly. They have built a system where survival means going to them, but once you show them you have alternatives, their empire collapses. The words pierced Traoré's core. His country had long been told that without French aid, IMF loans, or Western approval, it could not survive. Yet here was another truth. Survival was not born of begging, but of bargaining. The ability to choose partners was, in itself, a form of power. Mohammed bin Salman's expression softened slightly as he summarized his point. "Brother, this money is not money. It is a message that Africa and the Arab world no longer wait for orders. We make decisions for ourselves." That message weighed heavily on Traoré's mind. For him, it was confirmation of what he had long suspected. Politics was not a contest of good versus evil, but of strength versus weakness. The nations that controlled their resources, alliances, and strategies would shape the future. The rest would be shaped by others. As their first round of talks ended, Traoré leaned back in silence, his mind racing with possibilities. The deal before him was no longer just economic, it was historical. It carried the potential to either deepen dependency or redefine independence. The decision he would soon make would not only shape his presidency, but also alter the course of Africa's struggle for sovereignty. In that private chamber, Traoré realized something profound. Mohammed bin Salman had not offered him mere financial aid. He had handed him a new lens to view politics, not as generosity, but as chess. Not as survival, but as strategy. The world outside would keep talking of aid and development, but inside that room the truth was unveiled. Politics was a game of leverage, and the $2.5 billion was nothing more than the opening move. When the Crown Prince leaned in again, the warmth that had colored his earlier words faded. His voice sharpened, taking on the tone of a strategist revealing a hard truth. "Brother Ibrahim," he began slowly, "let me tell you what the West will never admit. Every dollar they lend, every grant they approve, every so-called aid package they send, its path is mapped out long before it ever reaches your hands. Nothing is free. Nothing comes without calculation. If you ever believe their money is charity, you have already surrendered." The bluntness of those words struck deeply. Traoré did not argue because he knew them to be true. For decades, his nation had lived under this unspoken reality. France claimed to assist Burkina Faso, yet each deal drained more resources than it gave. The IMF and World Bank promised relief, but what followed were endless cycles of debt, a trap designed to keep his people dependent. Mohammed bin Salman pressed forward. Colonialism never died, it simply transformed. The old empire sent soldiers to plunder your land. The new empire sent bankers to tie you down with contracts. The chains are no longer on your wrists, they are on your economy. And once your economy is bound, your politics are no longer your own. The words landed like a hammer blow. Traoré had spoken often of neocolonialism, but hearing it described so plainly from another world leader gave the idea fresh weight. This was not theory, it was lived reality. The Crown Prince's tone grew heavier. "Do you see why this deal matters? It is not the figure on the page. It is the existence of an alternative. In politics, alternatives are power. When a nation has only one source to rely on, it is not a partner, it is a servant. But when it can choose among many, it becomes a negotiator. And negotiation is freedom." That was the essence of the lesson. The $2.5 billion itself was not the true prize. The real prize was diversification. The ability to step outside the Western monopoly and force new terms of engagement. The room seemed to tighten as Mohammed bin Salman lowered his voice once again. "Never believe that any nation helps another out of kindness. Nations only act for interest. Even me, even Saudi Arabia. If I tell you otherwise, I am lying. The question you must ask is simple. Does your interest align with mine? If it does, then we can walk together. If it does not, then sooner or later one of us will use the other." The words echoed like a prophecy. Traoré understood why so many African nations had failed in the past. They signed agreements without asking the fundamental question, whose interest does this serve? And because they failed to ask, their countries were left in poverty. Their governments weakened, their resources stripped away. The Crown Prince was not only offering money, he was offering an education in survival. Then came an even sharper warning. "Once you take this deal," Mohammed bin Salman said firmly, "the West will not forgive you. They will call you corrupt. They will call you a dictator. They will brand you reckless. They will move to sanction you, to isolate you, to make you look dangerous. Because to them, this is not about Burkina Faso, it is about their empire of control. And by choosing differently, you have dared to escape it." Traoré clenched his fist, for he had already tasted this reality. The moment his government pushed French forces out, the propaganda machines had turned against him. International media painted him as radical, undemocratic, even dangerous. But his people knew the truth, that he was defending their sovereignty. Mohammed bin Salman's eyes narrowed with intent. But this is the beauty of politics. If you know the attack is coming, you prepare before it arrives. If you know isolation will be forced on you, you build your alliances early. And if you know they will call you names, then you tell your own story before they define you. This was more than advice. It was a strategy for survival. The Crown Prince was laying out the blueprint of how weaker nations could stand against the machinery of global powers. The conversation turned to something deeper: perception. The Crown Prince spoke with conviction. "Understand this, brother. Today, politics is not decided in parliaments or by votes. It is decided in the minds of people. Whoever controls the narrative controls the world." He explained how Western powers had mastered this art. Armies were no longer always needed. Wars could now be fought with narratives, fought in newspapers, television screens, think tanks, and digital campaigns. A leader could be destroyed by headlines before ever being judged by actions. Reality mattered less than perception, and perception was carefully crafted. Traoré sat silently, absorbing the lesson. He realized that the $2.5 billion was not only economic strength, it was narrative strength. Aligning with Saudi Arabia was also a way of countering the Western story with a new one. It was proof that alternatives existed, that Africa was not trapped, that sovereignty could be defended. The Crown Prince leaned back, his voice steady. "Politics, my brother, requires patience. It is not about quick gains, but about where you will stand decades from now. If you only think of today, you will always remain trapped. But if you prepare for the storms of tomorrow, you will endure beyond your enemies." That philosophy explains Saudi Arabia's own strategy: massive investments in futuristic cities. Vision 2030, the deliberate reshaping of an economy that could no longer depend solely on oil. These were not projects for the present. They were preparations for a world decades ahead, when the balance of power would look very different. For Traoré, this was an awakening. Too often, African leaders had thought only of immediate survival. They sold resources for quick cash, signed contracts for short-term relief, never building for the generations yet to come. This was why Africa remained rich in potential but poor in reality. But here was a different vision, one rooted in endurance and foresight. As the meeting drew toward its end, the Crown Prince's words became final and absolute. "Brother Ibrahim," he said, locking eyes with him, "never confuse politics with friendship. Politics is survival. Do not expect me to protect you for free, and do not expect the West to spare you out of mercy. In this world, only those who understand power survive. Use this deal not as a chain, but as a weapon. Do not let $2.5 billion purchase your silence. Let it purchase your independence." The room fell into a heavy silence. In that silence, Ibrahim Traoré felt the full gravity of the conversation. Politics was no longer theory to him, no longer the lessons of history books. It was alive, raw, and brutal. Deals were not transactions, they were battles. Money was not merely currency, it was influence. And alliances were never true friendships. They were calculated instruments of survival. At last, Traoré spoke, his voice steady but weighted with conviction. "Brother Mohammed, I understand now. This deal is not about money, it is about freedom. And I promise you, Burkina Faso will not use this as a chain of dependence. We will use it to stand taller so that our children will never bow again." The two men shook hands. Cameras outside would later record their smiles, and the headlines would describe it as a $2.5 billion agreement. But those who truly understood knew that what happened inside that room was far greater. It was the opening of a new chapter, a challenge to the very foundation of global politics. Because once a leader has seen the truth behind the mask of diplomacy, he cannot be controlled again. And Ibrahim Traoré had just witnessed that truth, spoken without hesitation by Mohammed bin Salman himself. To those who still believe politics is a matter of charity or goodwill, this story offers a different reality. Politics is war without weapons, conquest without soldiers, control without visible chains. And only those who play with their eyes wide open will survive. The $2.5 billion deal was never just about money. It was a mirror reflecting the true face of power. And once you see that face, your understanding of politics can never be the same again.